right, well, wasting no time now, we are going to get started with our first panel. So welcome to the 2022 Planetary Health Annual Meeting at Harvard University. I'd now like to introduce Kelly Meza Prado, who will moderate the session on updates from the field, snapshots of global environmental change. Kelly joins us from the Peruvian Andes and drives environmental work that is targeted at improving human health. She currently works at the Climate Change and Health Unit of the World Health Organization, supporting countries to deliver on their goals of making health systems low carbon and resilient to climate change. Kelly's also a next generation representative on the Planetary Health Alliance Steering Committee. You can learn more about all of our moderators and speakers on the annual meeting website. Welcome to Kelly.
Hello, you can see me, good. Thank you, Sam, for the introduction. What a dream to be welcomed by you. Thank you for hosting us and the whole Planetary Health Alliance for this warm welcome. I really like to extend deep gratitude to this meeting for welcoming all the traveling scholars. I was an ambassador myself a few years ago when I was doing my master's, and I think bringing all the youth together and hearing from them, it really enriches the conversation. If you haven't done so yet, I will encourage you to connect with at least one campus ambassador. You'll be surprised at the personal stories that they bring, as well as the work that they have been doing to drive forward this movement. And maybe you can offer some mentorship tips in return. So I am so honored to be here and moderate the first panel. And we're just going to have a chat about the latest developments on global environmental change from 4 leading experts and in their respective fields. So this is how the game will go. Each one of them will have 7 minutes to condense probably what is years of work. And I'm asking all of you to please write down your questions for the Q&A session. But fear not, because I ask each of our panelists to ask one question to the presenter in order to clarify some gaps. So after each presentation, the speaker that will follow will ask them a question, and in that way we hopefully get some clarification on some potential gaps. As Sam said, please do refer to our website if you'd like to learn more about them, as I will introduce them with short descriptions on the amazing work that they have been doing. I have the honor to introduce first Silia Watt-Cloutier. She's an environmental, cultural, and human rights advocate who, through her unique vantage point as an Inuit woman from the Arctic, attempts to teach the world about the importance of humanizing the issues of climate change. Next, we'll have Mohamed Bakarr. He's a lead environmental specialist in the Global Environmental Facility Secretariat, with responsibility for integrated programs designed to tackle drivers of global environmental degradation. Next, we have Dr. Michelle Tigchelaar. He's an interdisciplinary climate scientist working at Stanford University, and she looks at the impacts of climate change on food systems, spanning the aquatic and terrestrial and the ecological and human. And finally, we also have Dr. Phil Landrigan, who's a pediatrician and public health physician who directs the Global Observatory on Planetary Health at Boston College. So I'm asking you to welcome them with a round of applause, and it's over to you.
Technology is not my forte, so I'm hoping that this is going through okay. If somebody can indicate to me that it's a go. Yes? Okay. Good morning. I apologize for this. My strengths lie in different areas other than technology. So, but greetings to you all, and thank you very much for this invitation to relay a very short message to you this morning. But as we are all trying to address these issues from different angles, I have been doing this work of trying to humanize the issues of environmental degradation and climate change of the Arctic and its people for the past 27 years now. It's been a long time that I've been working on these issues of humanizing these issues from that perspective, because of the lived experiences of my own people and where we have come from, you know, a very short period of time, living a very traditional life, and then having to go through so many historical traumas that really have impacted our way of life, not just in terms of environmental degradation, but even the history of the historical traumas. So climate change and the environmental degradation of the Arctic are just a second wave that is upon us, and it has been for some time now. And all of these historical traumas have really impacted on the well-being and the health of our people in the Arctic. It has impacted us in ways that where we are known to have the highest suicide rates in North America because of that history. And trying to humanize these issues in a world that knows more about our wildlife than our people has been a daunting task, I must say. And also, you know, the importance of country food and the hunting is something that I really stress strongly about these issues, because the linkage there is not just about nutritional value of the food that we harvest and that we hunt, although that's really important for us as well, but the cultural value, the educational value, where our children are taught in a very holistic fashion out on the land, not just the technical aspect of becoming a proficient provider and a natural conservationist, but also their life and character skills are built there on that land. And all the more in this modern setting where we've had historical traumas and very tumultuous changes in a short period of time, do we need to prepare our children for those challenges and the opportunities of life? And so the educational value of building their character skills on that land is extremely important. The emotional value also, the connection to our identity, the grounding that we have when we are eating together, and the connection to our hunters and to our ancestry are all very important to us. The spiritual value as women are preparing the animals for food and the skins for clothing is a meditative state. And our men, as they're in a yogic position waiting for the seals to surface for long, long periods of time in the cold, is a meditative state, and they call it their peaceful place. And of course, that is really important for us who are now living in this very chaotic and precarious situation that we live in now, where we've had so many health issues related to what is happening now with our youth in terms of taking their lives rather than embracing them. So this is really about our children. And I think the world has been messaging this all quite in a different way that is not relating necessarily to families and children of the Arctic. And so it's not just about polar bears, it's not just about the ice, even though all of those are interconnected and interrelated. But really, we have to think about what's happening on the ground to us, the communities. And of course, the communal value and the medicinal value of our country food is extremely important to us. It keeps us extremely healthy on so many fronts. And so all of these things that we have been going through is something that we've got to try to get the world to understand, that we in the Arctic do not wish to be victims, just to be seen as victims of this historical context that we're coming from, or about this second wave that is upon us. As we're reaching out to our culture, because we're realizing now that the solutions lie to all the health and education and social problems that we're faced with due to the historical context. We realize now that as we're coming out the other side of recognizing that our culture is the medicine we seek to be able to get back on our feet and heal, we realize then that's that second wave that is minimizing our ability to do that, because things are changing so rapidly. The ice is forming very differently. The conditions are all changing very quickly, and it's becoming even more difficult for us to rely on that our culture to be able to get back on our feet and create on the land programming to be able to heal the younger generation that are at risk. Because this holistic way in which we teach our children, as I say, it's not just about the technical aspect, but the character building, the resiliency building, the coping skills, all of those life skills are taught very naturally on the land. And so we've got to try to protect that way of life and to keep us on that land, because we don't just want to be victims, and we do have teachings to offer to the world as well. So I'm finding that as much as we're realizing that culture and the land and our traditions is our medicine that we seek to be able to get back on our feet, we are also realizing that I think in observing what is going on in the world today, the disconnect that most people have with their environment, with their food source, with each other, is the problem, and that we can teach that. We don't want to just be victims of globalization and all of these issues that have come upon us in a very short period of time, but we want to be able to teach sustainability, and we have that ability. We have the ingenuity. We have the traditions that are just very powerfully connected to how we can live sustainably. And so I believe that Indigenous wisdom and knowledge is the medicine the world seeks in terms of all of the struggles and challenges that we're faced with. And I think we're at a time now, during this time of the pandemic and the recovery of the children at residential schools, that have softened the hearts, more so of the hearts of people in Canada and around the world. And that this is the time. The pandemic, I think, is trying to teach us those lessons of, it's not just about one country or one species of an animal that is the cause of all of this, but what we have been doing to our planet and to all wildlife, the habitat of all wildlife in the world for decades upon decades now. And so the Arctic, the ice, is the cooling system for the planet. It's breaking down. It is the air conditioner. It's breaking down, and it's creating all of the havoc around the world. That's that strong connection that exists there with the Arctic. So we as the people can be the signal, we can be the guardians, and we have been, because we have protected what we love. And if we can get people to fall back in love with nature, because we tend to think that it's nature deficit disorder that tends to make us disconnect from what is going on in our world. And so we've got to, I think, look to the people who still rely on the wellness of their environment and their climate to be able to teach the world about what sustainability feels like, looks like. And so this is the opportune time, I think. And I know that things will happen slowly, because it has been a long process. This is decades of the colonial approach to these issues. And I think it's going to be time now for us to really just come together and humanize this issue together and make it a real issue of our children and grandchildren, and not just, polar bears on the ice in the Arctic with no real human face to it. And it will happen at the speed of empathy, and it will happen at the speed of trust. In other words, the more people really understand our situation from a place of true understanding and empathy, then that will speed up that process of being able to develop the trusting relationships. So speed of empathy, speed of trust. And so
I'm afraid I'm gonna cut you here. Thank you so much for grounding us with your experience. Jeremy's looking at me, and he's gonna kill me if I don't remain on time. So I wanna go back to Peru in one piece. So I wanna invite Mohamed Bakarr, if we have him here, from the Global Environmental Facility, to ask you briefly one question about your experience as an educator, as a teacher, as an activist. So I wanna invite Mohamed. Is he joining us virtually? Thank you so much, Mohamed. Over to you.
Thank you very much again, Kelly. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Great.
we can hear you.
Great. Thank you very much again. And thanks to Sam, Mary, and Kevin, and the rest of the team who have trusted me with joining this very amazing panel. Just listening to Silia there, I really got inspired. Those are the kind of systemic shifts that we're hoping will really drive the kind of action that we need to have a better world for future generations. So I'm just going to talk briefly about what we are doing in the GEF, because you mentioned my experience as an activist, as a teacher. I have done a little bit of all of that thing, but I think what has inspired me over the last a few years actually is to see how the global community is really beginning to converge around a very a much needed approach to how we deal with global environmental challenges, and that's this systemic thinking, which puts people at the center of environment and natural resource management. You know, for many, many decades, we've kind of seen people as a problem, and try to come up with solutions that are independent of their own needs and their own priorities. But the knowledge and our growing understanding of the interconnectedness of our world is really beginning to change that. And so I'm particularly very appreciative of the momentum that the Planetary Health Alliance is creating to mainstream this kind of thinking. And I hope that we are on the right track to really scale up this momentum and hopefully inspire a new generation of leaders in the conservation world and the environment movement as well. In the GEF, we have been very much focused on trying to embrace this thinking, and it's reflected in the way we do our investments. So we are a financial mechanism for the global environment. We help developing countries tackle the most complex and difficult challenges facing the planet. And we do that by providing grants largely that is committed by the developed countries to help them meet their obligations under the various conventions. So traditionally, we separate the focal areas. We do biodiversity, climate change, land degradation. But over the years, especially the last few years, we've started taking a more integrated approach to how these issues are tackled. And we do that for many reasons, but I'll just, in the interest of time, just briefly highlight the key ones. First, we recognize that ecological, economic, and social drivers are all issues that need to be tackled together. We can't silo them, we can't address them independently. And of course, when we build things around people, all of these come into play. We also don't want to solve problems in one part of the world and then transfer them to another part of the world, what we call leakage. So we try to avoid leakage. We try to work across sectors and scales. Obviously, we know that governments have to work in the different sectors to try and pursue the development agenda, but these sectors always act upon one another. And so that's part of our desire to try and break those silos and connect them across scales as well as across institutions. We also try and focus our investment in a very transformative manner, in the sense that we're looking at investing in a way that we can push those levers that will then inspire the shift towards a more sustainable and resilient system, which is precisely what the planet needs. And then we also take a more purposeful programmatic approach. Instead of siloed investments, we try and think holistically about systems in which those changes need to happen. We also take into consideration the need for resilience and long-term sustainability of those investments. Let me just wrap up by highlighting one example of programming that is relevant in this context, and that's the food system. And we know that one of the biggest challenges facing the planet is how do we feed a growing population with the same natural resources on which we depend on for life. It's going to be a challenge. It's already becoming a challenge, but it's one that we cannot avoid because we have to feed, people have to eat and nurture themselves, and so that's inevitable. So how do you deal with environment in this context? So we've taken a very pragmatic approach in the sense that we recognize that there's still a large amount of land that is available for production. All we need to do is create a space where we can have an open discourse to shift production to those lands that do not impinge upon natural systems on which we also depend for other functions that support those production systems. Second, we also need to change the way we do the production itself, because we have a lot of practices that are outdated, no longer fit for purpose, and we need to shift them, and we need to do it across all scales, and we need to do it across institutions, and we also need to change the policies that drive those poor practices. And then thirdly, we need to look at how the entire food system is connected. So we can't just deal with production. We also need to think about the demand for those resources. We need to think about the supply chain and how do we change all of that. So this kind of systemic thinking can only happen if we have a very open discourse. And so one of the priorities that we have in the GEF is to create these platforms where we bring all stakeholders together to have a very candid discussion about the realities that we face in terms of the challenges, but also the opportunities that we have to shift some of the business as usual practices towards one that are more fit for purpose. And I'll stop there, Kelly, and see if there will be any questions for me to follow up on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. We are running a little bit late with the schedule, so I'm going to pass all the questions to the end. And I want to very quickly transition into the presentation of Dr. Michelle.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Is that all right sound-wise? All right, great. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this morning. I was just remembering how the last time, or actually the first time I met the Planetary Health Alliance was at Stanford in 2019, so it's really an honor to be with you on the other side of quite some major global events. And it's a real pleasure to share with you today some insights about how healthy aquatic ecosystems can support healthy and sustainable diets. So I think for this particular audience here, I don't really need to go over all the different ways in which our food systems are not delivering for people or the planet. Just last year, nearly a third of people globally were either moderately or severely food insecure. And at the same time, we know that our food systems are a major driver of greenhouse gas emissions and land and fresh water use, as well as biodiversity loss. So really, we need food system transformation both for people and the planet. And today I wanted to synthesize some emerging evidence about the important role of fisheries and aquaculture in being part of that food system transformation. And I will be drawing primarily on findings from the Blue Food Assessment. That's a series of 9 different papers that we coordinated on the nutritional contributions of what we call blue foods, as well as their environmental performance, the role of small-scale actors, the climate risk that they face, the projection of future demand. And for the academically inclined amongst you, on most of my slides, I have put up to 3 key references of things that have emerged in the last couple of years that you could reference to see as what the major advances have been. So the first thing I really want to emphasize is that what came out of this work is that blue foods are incredibly diverse. There's over 2,500 of species of aquatic foods that are produced globally, and they are produced in a very high diversity of both fisheries and aquaculture systems as well. So that ranges all the way from industrial trawlers on the high seas down to rice pond integrated aquaculture by smallholders. So there's a really wide diversity of systems and products that are coming out of our blue food production. And what that means, what that means is that the nutritional contributions of blue foods are really diverse as well. So what we know generally about blue foods is that they can be a really good source not just of protein, but also of essential micronutrients, as well as omega-3 fatty acids. So as such, they can really contribute to public health by reducing micronutrient deficiencies, they can support brain and eye health, and they can also be a healthy alternative to especially processed red meats. But the diversity between different types of blue foods is really high. So what you see in this graph, it compares the nutritional contributions of 2 types of really nutritious blue food species. So we have mussels and sardines to some terrestrial animal foods. So we have chicken and beef. And what we can really see is that for many of these nutrients, blue foods outperform some of the terrestrial animal-sourced foods. At the same time, there's also a lot of emerging evidence that many types of blue foods can be produced in ways that have environmental performances that are similar or better than chicken, which is considered the most efficient terrestrial animal-sourced food. But again, because of this high diversity in blue foods, we see really high diversity in environmental performance as well. So here on this graph, you see on the left for farmed and on the right for wild, a few species compared to chicken. And we see that, for instance, bivalves have carbon footprints that are much lower than that of chicken. But on the other hand, we also see that species like flounders have much higher greenhouse gas emissions. So blue foods as on the whole are not going to be a panacea. It really depends on which type of species and in what type of system. And it's also really important to know here that there is definitely multiple dimensions of sustainability. So just because something has a low carbon footprint doesn't make it sustainable. So many types of fed finfish, like salmon, for instance, are highly dependent on feed. So they have a really high land footprint. And for things like flounders, which are produced by bottom trawlers, we know that that has really devastating impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems. There's also been a lot of emerging evidence on the various ways in which climate change impacts the different types of blue food systems. And this is a schematic that summarizes some of the literature on that. So we see that certain drivers like extreme heat really impact all of the different systems, but certain drivers are specific to some types. So shifting fish stocks are really important for marine fisheries, whereas changes in crop production or increases in pests and pathogens are really big impacts for aquaculture systems. And what this map shows is how climate change is projected to put at risk the various nutritional and livelihood and economic contributions that blue foods deliver. And we see that in many countries, the combination of high climate hazards, as well as really high dependency on either fisheries or aquaculture for nutrition, livelihoods, or revenue, are also combined with a really high vulnerability to climate change. So we call this a triple jeopardy, and we see that this mainly or especially occurs in many tropical countries, in coastal and Central Africa, as well as in many small island developing states. So for blue foods to really be a part of healthy and sustainable food systems in the future, we also know that adaptation and investments in resilience are really important to sort of to bring that future about. And then finally, what I wanted to highlight was these synergies and trade-offs that exist between different sustainable development goals. We know that there are some opportunities for synergies between different types of blue food. So as I highlighted, there's really high nutritional benefits for some species and really low carbon opportunities for some species. And in many cases, these overlap. So for instance, bivalves and sardines are both examples of really highly nutritious and low carbon footprint species. On the other hand, we also know that there's definitely trade-offs between different sustainability outcomes. So in addition to, say, the bottom trawling that I highlighted before, we know that the rapid growth in aquaculture in many places has led to sustainability challenges like nutrient pollution as well as overuse of antibiotics. We also know that decent work in fisheries and aquaculture is not always the case. We've seen severe cases of labor abuse in industrial fisheries, and small-scale actors are often squeezed out of their resource. And then finally, a paper just released last month showed how the benefits delivered by blue food systems are not distributed equally. So oftentimes wealth-generating activities like producing things for export revenue come at the expense of welfare-generating benefits like food and nutrition security and livelihoods. So for blue foods to be part of sustainable futures, we really need investments or improvements in governance and practices that can make sure that those changes are sustainable across the board. And then finally, I was asked to reflect a little bit on policy opportunities for this work. So last year saw the first United Nations Food Systems Summit. This year, just later this month, we'll have COP27 in Egypt, and it's a COP where for the first time food systems are really prominent on the agenda. I believe there's about 6 different pavilions all tackling the topic of food. And then just on the heels of that, we'll have the biodiversity COP in Montreal. So there's a really big opportunity in the global scene to start to connect these food, climate, and biodiversity agendas. And our organization has been working with partners in governments and NGOs and academia to elevate this profile of blue foods in these international policy arenas. And just for the discussion here at the Planetary Health Annual Meeting, I wanted to highlight two particular challenges that I think we face there. First of all, it's really difficult to hold this nuance and understand diversity in these global contexts. We oftentimes in the narratives end up either in seaspiracy or in some kind of fish marketing campaign, and it's really difficult to understand that the truth might be actually somewhere in the middle or it might be very context dependent. And secondly, what will resonate with many people here is this connecting local to global. And to what extent can, say, a fishery-dependent country in the Pacific share objectives with an aquaculture exporter in the Nordic countries, and how can we elevate local issues in these global arenas? And I myself will be going to COP, so if anyone has good suggestions on how to do that, I'll be open for those throughout the meeting. Thank you very much.
I am glad I moved all the questions to the end because I'm sure we'll have many questions for you. So very quickly, I want to introduce or reintroduce Dr. Phil Landrigan for 7 minutes of summary of his lifetime work.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sam. Thanks to the Planetary Health Alliance, the whole team. Nice to be back in the place where my professional journey started so many years ago, across the street from my high school, that is. So I'm at Boston College now, and what I want to talk with you about is chemical and plastic pollution, which is an aspect of the planetary crisis that doesn't get the attention it deserves, and that's why I call it the stealth threat. So since World War II, the number of new chemicals has multiplied almost exponentially. Having troubles advancing my slides here. Virtually all of these chemicals are made from petrochemicals. They come from oil, coal, and gas. They're new materials that never existed on Earth. Very few of them have ever been tested for safety or toxicity. They are everywhere in the environment. They are in us. CDC does rolling surveys through the US population and routinely detect a couple of 300 chemicals in everybody in North America. And global production is increasing at a rate which is on track to double by about 2040, 2045. Here's a line graph, and that actually extends back to 1950 if we had an earlier slide. What about plastic? Plastic, of course, is a subset of synthetic chemicals. The typical plastic has a backbone, which is a polymer, a lattice of repeating carbon atoms held together by carbon-carbon bonds, the blue arrows. And then into this matrix are stuck a whole series of often very nasty chemicals, phthalates, bisphenol A, brominated flame retardants, chemicals that convey water repellency, like PFAS. These chemicals can comprise up to 50% of the plastic by weight. And when you think about plastic, you have to think about both the matrix and the additives. They go inevitably together. There's huge amounts of plastic in the world. The global production of plastic has tracked the global production of other synthetic chemicals. There is now about 8.3 million metric tons on Earth, which is a ton or more than a ton for each person on the planet. Annual production, like the production of chemicals, is growing exponentially. It's on track to double by 2040 and treble by 2060. And the biggest growth, by far the biggest growth, has been in single-use plastics, the stuff that you rip off a package or rip off your dry cleaning or rip off the table in the operating room and throw into the waste bin. It's a bonanza for the petrochemical industry because it's use, make, use, dispose, and then sell you another one tomorrow. And Right now, plastic production is responsible for between 5 and 10% of greenhouse gases, but that's on track to exceed 20% by 2050 if we stay on the current trajectory. Here's a graph showing the growth in plastic production from 1.7 tons back in 1955 to over 400 million tons today. And folks have referred to plastic as the fossil fuel industry's plan B. You might want to ask, how is it all connected to fossil carbon? Well, coal, oil, and gas are the root source of virtually all plastic. They all drive climate change. They all contribute to air pollution. It's really, think of it as a hydra with many heads, but a common root. And here's what I call the big switch, the transition that the fossil fuel industry is making from using fossil carbon as fuel that we burn to heat homes or drive vehicles. And as the market for fossil carbon fuel goes down, as the world slowly, too slowly, but nonetheless moves in the direction of becoming greener, they are switching to plastics. And the linchpin of this transition are these multi-billion-dollar plants called crackers, which transform oil, coal, or natural gas into the basic feedstocks of plastic. Here's one enormous cracker which is about to come online. This is outside Pittsburgh. There's another one that is planned for a town in Louisiana called Formosa, which has just recently been stopped by heroic people in the local parish down there, but knowing the composition of today's courts, that will probably be overturned. And it's no accident that very frequently, almost always, in fact, these facilities are placed in environmental justice communities. Plastic has badly damaged the ocean. It's nice to follow on Michelle's talk because there's some very clear linkages here. Somewhere around 10 or 12 tons of plastic get dumped in the ocean every year. The visible stuff on top of the ocean, the barrels, the fish nets, the Coke bottles, are called macroplastics, but over time they break down. In fact, most of the plastic in the ocean is microplastic, nanoplastic particles, which contain all of the nasty little chemical additives that I showed you in that earlier slide. Here's a graphic picture of the impact of macroplastics, the impact of microplastics you can't see. They're a little bit too small. You're all well familiar in this audience with the concept of planetary boundaries, Johan Rockstrom's work. An interesting and frightening development in this space is a publication just a year ago that the global production of chemicals and plastics appears to be approaching a tipping point where it exceeds planetary boundaries. The good news here is that plastic pollution, like every other form of pollution, can be prevented if we care to do so. The issue is not technology. The issue is courage. The issue is political will. And the best evidence that that can be done is the fact that we have succeeded in controlling other forms of pollution, such as air, such as water. And we've done so by passing laws, setting policies, monitoring and enforcing, and of course incentivizing new clean technologies. And as Silia said at the beginning of the session here, it's so important to put humans into these equations. It can't simply be technical fixes. They have to be human-centered approaches. Here's a nice little graph. We've all heard the trope that pollution control costs jobs, kills the economies. This slide, which I reproduced from the New England Journal of Medicine, puts the lie to that argument. The gray line tending downwards across the slide from 1970 to the present is reduction in air pollution in the United States. We have reduced our air pollution in this country by 74%, an unheralded triumph since the passage of the Clean Air Act. It shows that we know how to do it. And the green line at the top is the GDP, the gross domestic product, which in those same years has increased by 250%. So we've all heard that trope. It's simply not true. And the savings come in the form of longer, more productive lives and lower health care costs. Finally, this is just a series of interventions against plastic that need to be taken. I won't go through them in detail except to show them to you. I think the low-hanging fruit here, the place where we can make the biggest impact most rapidly, is in banning single-use plastic. And then the other big thing, which actually law just passed in California a few weeks ago, is to impose financial penalties for extended producer responsibility upon the plastic manufacturers. They can no longer irresponsibly make this stuff, throw it out in the environment, and externalize the damages and the costs upon the rest of us. And the moment of hope here comes from the fact that a year ago, under the guidance of UNEP, the UN Environmental Program, a process was started to build a global plastics treaty. And finally, I want to say in my last 26 seconds that plastic recycling is a scam. It does not work. In comparison to glass, where 90% is recycled, paper, 70%, only 10% or less of plastic is recycled. And in fact, much of what is counted as recycled is either burned or sent to low and middle income countries. To combat these dangers, we have formed something called the Minderoo Monaco Commission on Plastics and Health. We're working assiduously. The plan is to present our findings in Monaco this coming March under the sponsorship of Prince Albert, who is deeply committed to these issues. And with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that sovereign talk. We have about 20 minutes to open the plenary for questions. So I'm going to ask Dr. Michelle if you could come forward so we can be closer to the mic. And this is my first hybrid panel that I get to moderate. I wonder if we can bring the virtual speakers on the screen as to be able to have everyone on view. All right, I want to get us started with a high-level question, and I promise I will open it to you to ask questions to our speakers. And I'm just curious, I got introduced to planetary health myself in 2015 when I was in the middle of my 20-something first life crisis, and I wasn't really sure what the next step was for me. I was pushed to the human health sciences, and I was pushed to the environmental sciences, but really there wasn't a house where these both kind of found each other until I got a word about planetary health, and since then I felt like I am home and where I can seek mentorship and develop my skills at that nexus. But I do want to ask our panelists here, how do you feel that planetary health as a network has affected your work? What has it allowed you to do? What are the challenges? How do you see this framework in the sphere on which you operate? And I'm going to open that to any of the speakers today. We're a little bit shy, maybe. Thank you so much.
Oh.
Okay, I'll give the floor first to Silia and then to Phil. Go ahead, over to you, Silia.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. In the work that I've done over the many years, 11 of those years in my early political life of leading the Inuit Circumpolar Council, really, I hit the ground running at the time, if you recall, when the UN were starting up the negotiations for the Persistent Organic Pollutants Treaty, which led to the Stockholm Convention. And once again, you know, it was to be able to try to put the human face, the human dimension, and the human health issues to that issue. Because nowhere else in the world is really, I think, that the persistent organic pollutants and climate change so parallel, because they're both about human health and they're both about cultural survival. And so leading the campaign on that and putting the human face to it, where we didn't want it to just to become a chemical story or an environmental story, but one of urgent human health. And we were able to bring, you know, those countries together to address this issue and negotiate a treaty that would get rid of the dirty dozen at the time. Of course, there's many more toxins coming into play, and we find flame retardants are found in our polar bears for sure. And there are many others that ICC is working on today. But that work led me to believe that we can do this. The world can come together to address these issues. And that gave me the hope that we would be able to do that. And of course, climate change is quite a different matter, not a different matter, but it's a more challenging matter to try to get the world on side, because look how many COPs have we had so far, and how much emissions are really lowering as a result of that work. So I still have hope, though, that if we can, because of that experience I had in lowering those or actually eliminating those toxins at their source, and that our country food is safer to eat today, gives me that hope and that inspiration to carry on with the work that I do on climate change. But I don't do it politically anymore, because I have found that that is such a long, painstaking process to go through, that I work with civil society. And civil society is what gives me the hope, and the youth movements that are addressing the issues of climate change as well. But at the same time, as I say, I have seen evidence of the world trying to come together and coming together to come out with a successful convention, the Stockholm Convention, on these issues. So again, our food systems and the climate, all of those are one of the same, and that we've got to think about these issues as one of the same, just the same way in which I'm linking human trauma and planet trauma are one of the same as well. And if you have a chance, if you can look at my TED Talk that I gave in 2016 on that matter. So global processes, local to global, that's the work that I've been doing forever. And I know that there's hope there. I think, again, as I say, the pandemic is giving us that opportunity to really rethink about these kinds of connections, and how, because it has exposed the outdated policies, the racist policies, and the way in which the vulnerable peoples of the world, including the indigenous peoples and the Black communities in particular, have been so impacted by the pandemic, because they're already living in poor health systems and poor health conditions. And so we've got to start to think about these things in not just in systemic ways, but in ways that we're all very interconnected globally together.
Thank you, Silia. Phil?
Thanks, Kelly. So echoing what Silia said, I think the most powerful aspect of the planetary health concept is the way in which it brings together environmental health and human health. I think one of the great failures of communication of the last quarter century has been the failure of the climate change community to make their science real, immediate, concrete to the average person or the typical policymaker. It's all been about molecules in the upper atmosphere, the Keeling curve, elegant science, but remote from the lived experience of most people. I think what the planetary health movement does is bring it all together. It's analogous to what Pope Francis has called integral ecology, which brings humans and the landscape together. What Silia just talked about a moment ago, that it's not just polar bears and ice flows, but it's also the people in the far north. And I think that's a powerful insight. And when you put people into the equation, I join with Silia in saying there's hope here. We have controlled air pollution. We have controlled water pollution in the high-income countries. Some middle-income countries like China are beginning to do so. If we can control those forms of pollution, then we can control other forms of pollution. We can rapidly decarbonize. And I think we may still survive this crisis if we have courage, if we have leadership, and if we avoid some of the false messages that are being put out by some people in our society. Have to stay strong, have to stay together.
Thank you so much. And I want to open it to the plenary. You see that we already have one person standing for questions, so the microphones are on, so please go ahead.
So I have two questions for you, but first say that I'm a big admirer of your work and a fan since the Lancet pollution report.
Thank you.
So very exciting stuff. Now, concerning plastics boundaries, how do you calculate that we're overshooting it? That's curiosity. And the other question is about air pollution and how it decoupled from GDP. Because coming from the global south, what we've experienced is that the polluting industry has moved to global south. So I would expect that the reduced air pollution might be at least partially explained by the movement of the industry to China. So I just like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. So I think in answer to the first part of that, how do they assess that plastic and chemical production are exceeding the planetary boundary? I think the best way to put it is that they arrived at that conclusion by what's politely called expert elicitation, which means that a bunch of learned people, allegedly, sit around a table and put out their best guess. But what's it based on? It's based on this exponential increase in production of chemicals, exponential increase in the production of plastics, which is so extraordinarily complex that it exceeds any known or projected human capacity to monitor the trend, and it's clearly out of control. So I think that's the best I can put it, and if you really want to get into it, read the article by Person that came out last year in 2021. You're absolutely right that some of the reduction in pollution in high-income countries like the USA is the consequence of the translocation of industries overseas. It's not as if they actually picked up and moved, but it amounts to the same thing. What happened was that the strict regulations here and the high costs of production here reduced the American manufacturing base and caused it to reemerge in China, Malaysia, some of the Latin countries, and so on. That said, the emerging economies in the world, the low-income and middle-income countries, are at an inflection point where they have a choice. Countries that are still relatively early on the development curve can decide to go in one or the other of two pathways. One pathway, the dirty pathway, is to invest heavily in coal, in oil, in gas, put millions of dollars into building coal-fired power plants and lock themselves into coal, millions of dollars into building gas pipelines, lock themselves into gas and oil for decades to come. And that obviously is the path that Exxon and Chevron and Dow Chemical would like countries to take. The other is that countries in the global south have the opportunity, if the leaders are wise and resist the blandishments of Exxon, to leapfrog over that. It is not necessary to go through the purgatory of pollution to reach the bliss of prosperity. Countries can invest now, today, in solar, in wind, and in other non-nuclear forms of renewable energy, and achieve prosperity without pollution. I think that is actually within reach, given the 90% decline in the cost of producing electricity from the sun, the 70% decline in the cost of producing electricity from wind that we've achieved in the past decade.
Go ahead.
Hi, this could be for Phil, but for everyone else as well. So I'm Daniel London from the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and I think we're doing a great job showing the connection between climate change and planetary health. And the question is, what is driving climate change? And to no small extent, as Phil is talking about, it is extractive, speculative kinds of industries. And to undo that requires potentially more than pollution control, but also changing the nature of industry financing and changing patterns of ownership within industry. And within our network, there are many health organizations who recognize this need and are pressing for economic systems change as a route towards planetary health. But I'm wondering if you or some other folks could speak to how you see the role of economic systems change in bringing about planetary health, and conversely, what is the role of the Planetary Health Network and practitioners in bringing about an economic system that honors human needs and planetary boundaries. Thank you.
It's a very important question, and I think the question actually offers some answers, because clearly we live in a global community that is largely driven by the corporate world, which is increasingly very powerful and very influential. I think what we need to do is as I mentioned in my brief intervention, to create space to engage these corporate entities, because they do penetrate all of the different aspects that we've just discussed here, whether it's plastics or it's blue food or food systems in general. And most of what they are investing in to make profit is things that humanity also doesn't give up on using. So at some point, we do have to sit around the table. And I know that there are some industries that clearly are no longer sustainable, and we have to find ways to shift them. But we can't shift them independently. We need to sit around the table and engage these players. And what we do in the GEF is create opportunities for countries, recipient countries we call them, but mostly developing countries that tend to be at the receiving end of most of these corporate challenges, to have a very frank discussion about how do you leverage what nature has to offer, and be able to address the industry, the development of the industry with that lens, so that it's not an afterthought. I think this is the dilemma we faced for decades, where environment is always an afterthought, and then it undermines the livelihood of people and society in general. But if environment is brought to the table up front, then we can actually ask the question, how do we harness what nature has to offer, whether it's for industry or for transforming different types of production sectors. All of these things have a direct link to nature, and that's how we shift the resources. We can start to then shift the economic, the financial system towards embracing those practices that are much more accommodating of what nature has to offer. So it's happening as we speak. It's happening in many of the sectors, but we need to do more. And I think the question that you asked, Kelly, about what the Planetary Health Alliance can do. Yesterday I was in some of the sessions, the side events yesterday. I had some really exciting presentations from small countries like the Gambia, where young people are coming together and developing industry. They are talking about finance. They are talking about how do we develop a financially viable industry that is based on environmental sustainability, as opposed to something else that then environment is an afterthought. So it's happening, and I think we just need to do more of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohamed. Michelle.
Hello?
Hi, yeah, thank you for this important question on where are the financial resources going, and how can we, what industries are they supporting? But I think there is a parallel question of what financial resources are available to countries and people to invest in solutions and adaptation mechanisms. And as I look to COP27, I'm really excited to see what's going to happen around the negotiations on loss and damage. I think there's a really big push from countries that are on the receiving end of a lot of climate impacts to find mechanisms for repair that would be funded by the damaging countries. And at the same time, we also know that debt is a really big limiting factor for different countries to make the investments that are necessary to shift to more resilient food systems, for example. And I'm really looking forward to meeting people from the delegation of the Seychelles in Egypt, who will be talking about how they are able to cancel some of their national debt in exchange for investments in improvements in aquatic ecosystems and adaptive food systems. And So in addition to thinking about how we direct financial investments into different industries, I think there's also a lot of creativity necessary when we think about the adaptation and debt type of space. So my 2 cents there.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I hate to do this, but we have to close the first panel, and I'd like to thank very profoundly to Silia all the way from Canada, to Dr. Phil, to Mohamed from the GEF, and Dr. Michelle. Dr. Phil and Michelle will be staying here, so please do stick around if you have further questions, and good luck with the next 2 days of the Planetary Health Conference. Thank you so much for being here.